God morgen, alle sammen. Og velkommen til dag 2 av konferansen De to Koreaer dialog mulig. Vi hadde jo i går Geir Helgesens store foredrag, hvor svaret der var veldig klart og entydig ja. Dialog ikke bare mulig, det kanskje også det eneste her videre. I dag får vi 4 foredrag etterfulgt av en paneldebatt av de 4 foredragsholderne. Og vi fantastisk privilegerte på Lillehammer i dag, som har så mye kapasitet omkring Korea og spørsmål om sikkerhetspolitikk i Nordøst-Asia til stede her. Det en dag som lyser litt i løpet av året. Så jeg vil takke alle dere 4 som skal snakke i dag, virkelig for å ha kommet. 3 stykker den lange veien fra København, og Stein Tønnesen fra Oslo. Det også sin vei. Han kunne ha valgt å være i Singapore i dag i stedet, og av ulike årsaker havnet her. Jeg ikke sikker om det bare vår skyld, men han her, og det vi utrolig glad for. Den første som skal snakke Morten Hansen, som jeg jo da kjenner fra København. Og jeg skammer meg litt over å si at jeg har bedt ham om å snakke engelsk. For det første så jeg nordist, og jeg har selv undervist på norsk i Danmark i flere år. Men jeg var så redd for at foredraget skulle være vanskelig å oppfatte på dansk for publikum her. Sånn at det finnes både i PowerPoint og i språklig drakt på engelsk. Men under paneldebatten i ettermiddag så vil det hele foregå på norsk-dansk. Så de som ønsker å høre klangen av det danske, vil de høre det da. Og det samme gjelder jo Peter Kim Lausen, har også fått beskjed om å holde foredrag i dag på engelsk. Men dere kan selvsagt etterpå stille spørsmål på norsk. Men husk på, det vanskelig for dansker å forstå norsk når den blir alt for tydelig. Prøv å være litt avslappet i det. Det jo det som det nordiske problemet i forståelsen. Alt for tydelig på norsk, det går ikke bra. Morten Hansen, jeg vil be deg komme opp og innta podiet her og holde ditt foredrag om Voldens diplomati, en spilteoretisk analyse av Pyongyangs adfærd. Velkommen skal du være.
Thank you very much. Is this clear enough? Yes? Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. When Unirene invited me to the conference, I was first of all very pleased, and we had the discussion about language, and we were sort of going back and forth, English, Danish. There was no chance that I could learn Norwegian within such a short period of time. So I was trying to think what comes across best. And then I fell over this Norwegian comedian, I think his name is Morten Hansen. And it occurred to me that when I speak Danish, it sounds to you guys like this Norwegian comedian, then I'd better speak English. So, because this is a serious subject, and I think we're on the safe side, and I'm sure you can all understand when I speak English, and in the panel session we'll do it in Danish, Norwegian, as you said, which is all fine. I'm happy after I've presented to take questions in Norwegian. I'm happy to answer in Danish, and I might use a few words in Danish here and there to clarify things. Yesterday, after Geir was on and gave his lecture, it was a little bit daunting because he's dealt with this subject for so many years, and I've dealt with this subject for only a very few years. Actually, I moved to Seoul back in 2009. I did a PhD. I met lots of interesting people. My PhD is not quite finished, but I'm working on the dissertation. And I did many courses on North Korea, intelligence, met a lot of fascinating people who've dealt with this subject matter for a long time. And it's daunting when you are surrounded by so many experts as we are here today, and Geir is a very good example. So yesterday when he was talking, it was a bit frightening for me with sort of, relatively speaking, a lack of experience. But then something occurred to me. I had a conversation with Evans Revere, who's an American diplomat who'd worked on North Korea for many, many years. And he told me that the more I deal with North Korea, the more I know I don't know about North Korea. it reminded me of this quote from Donald Rumsfeld. He talks about the known knowns and the known unknowns. And the more experience you gain on North Korea, the more you know that you actually are completely in the blind or somewhat in the blind with respect to what it is the North Koreans do. So actually, when you're just starting out, and I did this graph just this morning when I woke up, it made me feel a lot more happy about my presentation. Basically, if this is experience, I'm not sure if you can see it, if this is experience and this is time lapsed, basically the known unknowns, so everything you know you don't know about North Korea goes like this. Everything you actually do learn about North Korea moves a lot slower. So basically when you're just starting out, as I am, or as you are perhaps, the knowledge gap between what you know and what you don't know is very small, whereas for Geir Helgesen, the knowledge gap is huge. So there is in fact an advantage of not having dealt with North Korea for a very long time. That made me a lot happier about today's presentation, and I'm not sure how that makes you feel, Geir, but we'll see later on.
You're totally right.
Okay, I wanted to say a few things before I start out, just on what I think is important to keep in mind when dealing with North Korea. First of all, we have to try, at least as far as I'm concerned, to separate our emotions and feelings with more level-headed, cold, distant analysis, I think. Because if we read books like the Escape from Camp 14 or the UN Human Rights Report, we get very angry. And that's understandable. It makes perfect sense. There are horrible crimes taking place in North Korea. There is no question in my mind. There is no question in my mind about the horrific things that the regime do. Now, if we focus too much attention to our feelings and emotions, we will have a very tough time trying to understand, put ourselves in Pyongyang's shoes. So what I try to do is I try to put the emotions aside when I deal with North Korea, or certainly have that debate at a different time from this debate that I'm going to try and have with you guys today, which is on how does Pyongyang calculate its actions. What does the world look like to North Koreans, and how is it that perhaps many of these horrific events are able to take place in North Korea? So that's one thing I'd like to for you guys to keep in mind. There's another thing. When we read about North Korea, I think the best works that have been done have all as a starting point that they take North Koreans and the regime in Pyongyang seriously. I think there's too much in the media, particularly mainstream media, that sort of plays a joke on North Korea. You've all heard about the world records in golf and the lavish lifestyles of the leaders, the big cars, and the expensive bottles of rum that are imported, all of that. And that characterizes, I would say, probably 90% of mainstream Western media. That's a problem, because if we do that, we're sort of ridiculing the leadership, we're ridiculing North Korea. We're doing exactly what North Koreans actually somewhat do themselves, is they consider the outside world inferior to themselves. We do the same with North Korea. We consider North Koreans inferior, certainly the regime in Pyongyang. We consider them not educated enough, not willing to discuss international affairs like we would like it. So let's start by taking North Koreans seriously. That's what I try to do when I look at North Korea. And those were sort of the main points: the knowledge gap, taking North Koreans seriously, and then try and leave the emotions behind. If you can do all that, then I think my presentation will make more sense. So what I'd like to talk to you guys about today is what I call the diplomacy of violence. This term is not my term. This is a term that Thomas Schelling came up with, an economist and Nobel laureate who worked on game theory. So I've called it a game theoretical analysis of Pyongyang's behavior. That sounds more fancy than it actually is, but it's a way of looking at North Korean actions by way of what might their rational calculations look like. What I'd like to do is just to bring up a few general observations that I've made about North Korea, because I think they're important in relation to what I'm going to say after and to my analysis. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what is game theory. I'll try and make this very brief, because we're here to talk about North Korea, not game theory itself. And then the diplomacy of violence. And I'm going to talk to you about the restraints in war, because I think the restraints in war, and I think this is something that Stein Tønnesen might be dealing with, or certainly his views on the Korean War. It's something that we need to understand when we look at the conflict, not just the Korean War back in the 50s, but also how the conflict looks today. Restraints, and then finally, symbolic thresholds. And the symbolic thresholds are what characterizes what is doable from a military, political perspective in the conflict and what is not. So I'll try and raise a few points about that. Now, first of all, with respect to these general observations about North Korea, this book I would urge anyone who's interested in North Korea to buy and read. This is an American scientist who's dealt a lot with culture. He's probably of a similar background as Guy Helgesen. What he's done is he's analyzed North Korea by way of looking at their propaganda. So basically what he's doing what I just said before. He's taking North Koreans seriously, because he's actually analyzing what the North Koreans are telling themselves and what are they telling the outside world about North Korea. And what is that? Well, basically they're telling us that leaders and the people have to try and strive towards purity, childlike behavior. In North Korea, the child is innocent, it's threatened, and it's pure in its thought. It's only when we grow up that we become manipulative, we become strong, we begin treating people with less respect. In North Korea, the leader is considered pure and childlike throughout his life. Anything the leader says or does is right because he is of this pure nature. That's why some of the North Korean propaganda you see in the picture up here, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the first and second leader of North Korea, surrounded by children. This is to sort of highlight this issue of purity, surrounded by the children. They consider their race pure, actually much like the South Koreans when you go back and look at Korean sort of mutual history. They consider their race pure, and they consider foreigners such as us as inferior to them. We could never come to the same level. That's important to understand when we look at their actions. When we look at North Korea in terms of six-party talks, international frameworks for negotiation, they will never consider us an equal. In their deepest inner, they will consider themselves superior to us. That's important to understand. Also, you talk about a very patriarchic society. Actually, it's a very maternal society, according to the readings, the text, and the pictures, and so on. So the leaders have a sort of motherly nature. Women play an important part. Sometimes they're tucked away, not unlike what you might associate with the Middle East and so on, but they're actually, it's the mothering nature of the protective nature of the leaders that is worth focusing on. Monoethnicity is another one. What I thought I'd just finish off with, in Korean language, the term wegu, meaning foreigner, is a little bit different from when we talk about foreigners. So basically, when I am here, I consider myself a foreigner. Less a foreigner in Norway than if I were to go to North Korea, probably, but a foreigner nevertheless. For a Korean, it's slightly different. Actually, when a Korean, whether a South Korean or North Korean, doesn't matter, when a Korean travels abroad, the people living there, so the citizens, are still the foreigners. So basically for a Korean, no matter where he is, whether he's at home or whether he's in a foreign country, he's still the Korean, and the rest of them are the foreigners. And I think it's a different way of thinking, because what we try and do, we try and accommodate the people when we are guests in their country. And in Korean language, it's a little bit different, and it goes back to this issue of nationalism, of inferiority. So I think that's another important point to keep in mind when we look at their behavior. The personality cult of the North Korean leaders are extremely important to understand the regime. Basically, the overall point here is that you do not question the regime. Some of the things, I wrote an article last year, or the year before perhaps, and I came up with these two pictures. I found both of them sort of individually on the internet. Kim Jong-un, the current leader, this is his grandfather. So the founding father of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. You can see the resemblance, right? From the haircut, the sheer appearance. Now there were speculations that Kim Jong-un had plastic surgery to make him look like his grandfather. There were talks in Korean, sort of popular, North Korean popular culture. There's talk about Kim Jong-un being his grandfather reincarnated. And it's all things that are done to sort of reinforce this personality cult about the leader. Leaders are divine, they have superhuman skills. It's no wonder that the propaganda in relation to world golfing records and skiing records, it's all possible because for a North Korean, their leader is their god. It's not surprising that you would associate that with superhuman skills. They are superhuman by their very definition. If you recall the scenes from Kim Jong-il's death, we talked about the tears. Are they genuine? Are they because the regime will hunt them down if they don't cry and show their sadness? I believe they're genuine tears, and I think there's a reason for that. When a North Korean leader dies, and there have only been 3 since the Second World War, what happens when a North Korean leader dies is that the very foundation of North Korean society is shaken completely. They're highly insecure about what will come next. They don't know who the next leader is. They might have speculations, but what will the future bring? What we have to consider in this respect is when a North Korean leader dies, it's not just a head of government that dies, like a prime minister or a president. No, it's a head of government, it's a head of state, and it's their god, all in one figure, all in one person. So basically, imagine that if you're very religious, and in one and the same day, your prime minister, your king or queen, and your god dies, and you don't know what's next. Now that's what a leader's death in North Korean culture feels like. I can't even imagine what that feels like, but I can certainly understand that this could bring about some sadness and some frustration and some uncertainty with respect to what will tomorrow bring. So as far as I'm concerned, these tears are very much genuine, they're very real tears, and we shouldn't confuse ourselves about that fact. And then a remark on internal security. Something we have to keep in mind when we hear about labor camps, when we hear about prisons and terrible conditions within North Korea, is that these are all considerations of internal security. Basically, back when North Korea was founded, when Major Kim Il-sung and his 60 comrades in arms rode in on their horses into North Korea, they were fighting on Soviet side, and there was a struggle internally. And the struggle back then was not a struggle between communist North Korea and capitalist West. No, actually the struggle at that time, because division had already been made, was a struggle internally between North Korean nationalists like Kim Il-sung and the intellectual communists who were loyal and had allegiance with Moscow. That was the enemy. The enemy to the North Koreans were the communists. They were also the people who were loyal to the Japanese imperialists and so on. There were many categories of enemies, but the intellectuals who wanted to change North Korean society and create a version of it similar to what you had in the Soviet Union, they were considered, as Kim Il-sung built up his regime, as the enemy. It goes completely counter this idea of pure thought and whatever the leader says is correct. The authoritarian principles clashed with this will of the people and the sort of historic materialism of communism. Another point is what then happens based on how do we consider the various parts of society, this Songbun fragmentation scheme was set up. You had a core class, a wavering class, and a hostile class. The core class, the people closely associated with Kim Il-sung, loyal to him, and faithful to this new idea of North Korea. And then you had a wavering class that could go either way. They were sort of in between, not necessarily loyal to the Japanese or Moscow, and not necessarily the other way around. So they were sort of in between. And then finally you had the hostile class, people who were working on the Japanese side during the war and so on, considered a hostile class. Once you're put in that class, the descendants, the descendants of that bloodline, because bloodline is so important in North Korea, the descendants of that bloodline are considered part of that class as well. It's very difficult to break out of those classes. There are actually in North Korean society subdivided into 51 categories allegedly, and what is often argued, a North Korea expert I talked to in Seoul talked about approximately 2,000 people. This was a few years ago, and this number is arbitrary, admittedly, but in his view, 2,000 people, traceable back to Kim Il-sung and his 60 comrades in arms, are what make up the top of Pyongyang, the top of the regime today. And how is internal security today managed? Well, indoctrination, schooling, history books, propaganda, buy-offs if you're important enough, everything else that you might find in the authoritarian toolbox to keep the country in check. So geographic mobility, isolation from the outside world, and everything else that goes with it. It's all done due to sort of internal security concerns. There is an external security concern as well, but I'll get back to that one. The latest elections, this 100% election participation and 100% voted for the #1 candidate, it worked in practical terms in that way that you have one candidate to vote for. You can go into one voting booth and you can put a cross and vote for your candidate, or you could go into a different one, cross out the line of your candidate and show that I do not support my candidate. No North Koreans do that because it obviously is directly in contrast to what the regime wants. Elections in North Korea are not about democracy. They're about internal security. They're about census, counting the people. Now, why would you want to count the people? Well, you want to figure out who is where. Have people defected to China? If they have, a security investigation will be done. Family members, one step up, one step down, the bloodline will be rounded up, possibly thrown into labor camps, and so on and so forth. So elections is just the very latest example in North Korea of an exercise in internal security. That's how the system works, I would argue, from an internal point of view. So basically, this regime, how does it survive? It needs a few things. It needs a foundation. First of all, it needs the personality cult I was talking about, and it needs nationalism. And these two are mutually reinforcing items. Whenever you support your leader, you support your nation and your nationality, and vice versa. So basically, there is no room for nuance in this respect. The people trust their leaders with their decisions, regardless of how brutal their decisions are and how unfair they may seem. So even if you have little, you trust that the leader is much wiser, he knows what's best for you. The pure, unspoiled, and childlike leader always knows best. And what does the regime require? It requires isolation, and it requires an external threat. Isolation, it gets from rounding off its, sort of sealing off its borders. A threat, it achieves by keep provoking the world outside. Keep provoking the US, keep provoking South Korea, because that plays completely into the hand of North Korea's regime. There is no reason why the regime in Pyongyang would take genuine steps to negotiate a peaceful resolution and reunification of the peninsula, because it would mean regime suicide. They need a threat from the outside. The Americans are a very, very forceful and very efficient threat for Pyongyang. How did they obtain this? And basically, it's gotten me quite a bit of time, but it's gotten me to sort of the main focus of what I think we need to do in analyzing Pyongyang. and that is through rational calculations of how best to ensure your status quo, the regime in place, how to best ensure isolation from the outside world, the Jujie principle, self maintenance, and the threat from the outside, ensuring that there will be no resolution on the peninsula, because that is obviously what the regime lives off. Okay, game theory. Game theory is something that applies in particular to the financial world or economic scholars, for instance. Many of these ideas were developed back in the 50s and 60s by primarily American scholars. One of them in particular I'm going to talk to you about today, and it's not only in the financial world, but in political affairs, foreign affairs, it's been applied as well, and that's what we'll try and do today. But basically, in very overall terms, game theory can be considered a study of strategic decision making in relation to conflict and cooperation by intelligent, rational actors. And I consider Pyongyangs leaders as intelligent, rational actors. You could always argue whether many of the principles that game theory is built on, perfect information, is rational behavior even possible, but certainly that they strive toward this, I think is quite clear. Now in this application, it specifically builds on rational choice theory, which is the assumption that states will always act in self-interest and try and maximize their utility. So it can best be described as a cost-benefit calculation where your political decisions are based on how can you best gain from whatever action you take. This is the guy who, in my opinion, has written the best work, not necessarily focused on North Korea, but the best work of international affairs if you want to understand the Korean conflict back from the Korean War and up to this day. His book, he's written a few books, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics for a different book that was more economic in nature. But his book, Arms and Influence, is quite commonsensical. There are quite natural principles which we intuitively understand. It's about the use of violence in the analysis of conflict. And it's the main point about this book is that you need to distinguish between violence as the use of brute force, just hurting someone else, which doesn't make sense except for if you enjoy inflicting pain on other people. You'd have to be sort of mad or psychologically unsound to enjoy that sort of thing. And that's not why the North Koreans do it. They use the power to hurt as a bargaining tool. That's what Thomas Schelling's book is all about. Using violence as a tool of diplomacy. And that's what the North Koreans are doing. Outcomes in situations of conflict depend on how this bargaining is conducted and the various games that you can apply, prisoner's dilemma, the chicken race. What I often find on the nuclear issues is that you have to consider, try and imagine a North Korean at the edge of a cliff and the American right next to him. They're chained to each other, and the North Korean keeps saying, "I'll jump if you don't do X, Y, Z." And the American says, "No, you won't, because that would be suicide." And then the issue for the North Korean is to try and make the threat as credible as possible. Try and convince the Americans that I'm actually mad enough to do this. For North Koreans to appear a little bit mad actually makes good sense, because they might just be mad enough to throw themselves and all the rest of us into sort of a nuclear havoc. And that's sort of one of that's some of the thinking behind the North Korean actions. Now, on the diplomacy of violence, I think I've said what I need to say in order to move on, because we're time is running. But basically, just remember that diplomacy and the use of force, the North Korean provocations, it's all bargaining tools. It's all about sending a message to your counterpart, whether that be South Korea, China, or indeed the US. It's all about, in their case, retaining the status quo, retaining a very forceful enemy on the outside. So this bargaining can be extremely rude. The Cheonan sinking is very rude. It's vicious indeed, but it's done for a certain reason, and it's done with a certain calculation in mind. And that's what the diplomacy of violence becomes a very good guide and a guidebook for us to analyze North Korean decisions. One of the points that comes out of his book is that wars, even all-out wars, where thousands or even millions of people are killed, are fought with restraints. We put sort of bonds on ourselves. In the Korean War, it was an all-out war in the way it was fought on the battlefield, but it was a limited war with respect to these restraints that both sides of the conflict accepted. What were those restraints? So, no nuclear weapons. That was a no-go after the Second World War, when General MacArthur even suggested nuclear weapons. He was put out of commission, he was moved away. Truman would not have it. No Russians involved, no Chinese territory. The Americans could easily have bombed north of the Yalu River on Chinese territory. They did not. No Japanese territory, no bombing of ships at sea, or even airfields in the United Nations side of the line. There's one left out here in the book, and that's obviously the city of Busan in the south. Busan was also off limits. No bombing of Busan. Now, how did these restraints come about? It's difficult to say, really. There's a lot of symbolism, but they all mean, as to these symbolic thresholds, they all mean that we are dealing here with a game changer. Using nuclear weapons is a game changer. Crossing the Yalu River is a game changer. And there are many other game changers. But these symbolic thresholds, they do something. They keep a conflict contained. They ensure that we can have an all-out war about the peninsula. We cannot make it an all-out war between the major powers in the world. That's why, if we were to have another Korean War, and I don't believe we will, but if we were to have another Korean War, it'd probably be a limited war again. It'd be a vicious, bloody, and terrible war, but it would be fought on the Korean peninsula, not a Third World War type. I don't believe that. And I think there's enough historical evidence to suggest that these wars will be fought in limited fashion. I'm happy to send these out because I won't go through all the points just now. These are the symbolic thresholds from the Korean War. Today's restraints and symbolic thresholds, because there are many restraints to this day as well. We should not expect any action from the North Korean regime. There would be many game changers that they would not consider. So today, in my opinion, the restraints or the symbolic thresholds that the North Korean regime will not cross is no mainland attacks. You cannot attack mainland South Korea. It's a no-go. You cannot attack mainland Japan, and even with the missile range capabilities, you cannot obviously attack US territory, Guam, Hawaii, whatever the case may be. Another one, no US targets final. I mean, I think that's a pretty obvious one. That's something that would not be tolerated, even if the Americans today would have a tough time responding as the South Koreans do. But I think the North Koreans would not make this mistake. So, US targets, civilian or military, out of the question. No ROC civilian targets. Actually, we have to keep in mind that the North Koreans consider their brothers in the South, not the regime in Seoul, but the South Korean people. They consider them their fellow countrymen. What they did with the Cheonan attack, or the Waipit, the Yongpyeong-do attack, where 2 civilian Koreans were killed, if I recall correctly. They sent an apology for killing these 2. It was inadvertent, they did not mean it, and they were very sorry that these 2 South Korean civilians were killed. That's another important one to keep in mind. That said, South Korean military target, especially under certain conditions, for instance, in the west of the peninsula, around the northern limit line, which is obviously a unilateral line defined by the Americans and the West, and not acknowledged by North Korea. So whenever you are targeting around the northern limit line, that's okay if there are military targets in North Korea's perspective. And obviously, it goes without saying that nukes are still a symbolic threshold, and it's still a game changer that would not be accepted. Which, to me at least, makes the whole nuclear program in Pyongyang a not very credible deterrent. I'm going to skip through these. This is just a list of some of the conventional provocations that North Korea has carried out. I think it's worthwhile looking at these and seeing how do they fit in to symbolic thresholds, how do they fit in to the scheme of calculating rationally what you can do, what you cannot do. It seems you can go quite a long way if certain conditions are met. On the Chonan sinking, it's the point that I was mentioning just before. The northern limit line means a lot to the Americans and the South Koreans. It means a lot less to the North Koreans. Now, the North Koreans know exactly what's in the armistice agreement, but they know exactly what they've signed up for and what they haven't. And sometimes they play this gray zone. They're very good at playing the gray zones, what can be done, what cannot be done, because when you're challenging a gray zone, you're making retaliation from the other side extremely difficult. North Koreans are calculating that whatever we provoke, the West is forced to sort of contain themselves. They have to be smart about it. They cannot escalate the conflict. And I think in this case, Chinese, Russian, ASEAN, so Southeast Asian responses played right into the hands of Pyongyang. There was no sort of firm position in the international society about the Chonan sinking. Nuclear missile program brinkmanship is another one. I think it's another area of dual-use technology. You can use a nuclear program for energy. You can use a missile program to launch satellites. And it's another area where the North Koreans are playing this gray zone very efficiently. I'm going to skip through all of these. I think his trips, so this American scientist, Siegfried Hecker, who travels to North Korea all the time and gets these guided tours at their nuclear facilities, shows us that the North Koreans need us to believe that their nuclear deterrent is there and it's forceful. They need to tell us at every chance they get that we have a very elaborate nuclear program. It's a deterrent. We shouldn't buy into that argument. We could actually call Pyongyang's bluff in this respect. I'm going to skip through this, and it's the same with the missile program. So basically, yes, missiles can be used to launch rockets. As this guy, Carl Baker, said, some basic term, I think he mentioned that rocket science is, we don't have to be rocket scientists to make sense of rocket science. So basically, the issue here is that at its most basic terms, to launch a missile, you need a rocket. To put a satellite, peaceful satellite, up in orbit, you need a rocket too. And they're playing on this duality, the North Koreans, and they're doing it in a very skillful fashion. And it makes your response from the international community extremely difficult. I'm going to conclude by just mentioning this quote. And I'm not sure if it's the verbal quote. I think I had it in Danish from an article I wrote. But Ralph Cossa, who's a North Korean expert, once said that not understanding an adversary's rationality does not exactly mean that the adversary is necessarily irrational. We have a tendency to call North Koreans irrational. In my opinion, Pyongyang's behavior is very rational if you take your time and sit down and actually make the calculations and consider the mindset of North Koreans when they do what they do. I think we have to ask ourselves, is our behavior all that rational? North Koreans, when dealing with us, have generals who've done this for 40 years. When we deal with them, we have politicians and military officers who've done this work for 3 or 4 years. They're far ahead of us in terms of strategic and tactical calculation, and it's something worth keeping in mind. And just as a final note, in terms of resolution, I think we do not necessarily want reunification on the peninsula any more than the North Koreans do. For Washington, it's about money. They are not willing to pay for it. For Seoul, it's about a shared culture which is slowly disappearing. We see this with the young people. For Beijing, they need it for geopolitical terms. They need their buffer zone. I think that still applies. And for Pyongyang, obviously, to accept reunification unless it were on North Korean terms, which is totally unthinkable. So to accept reunification in a model that is acceptable to the international community is regime suicide. It might do good for the Korean people. It certainly would not do any good for the Pyongyang leadership. I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you very much.
Tusen takk skal du ha, Morten. Det var et forbilledlig klart opplegg. Og jeg må bare beklage at jeg har forlatt et av mine viktigste prinsipper her, å holde de nordiske språkene åpne overfor hverandre. Men det var av den ene grunn at jeg visste at det ville være så mange gode poenger i det dere brakte med dere fra København, at jeg ville være sikker på at det virkelig ble forstått i nyansene. Og det ble det på engelsk her, så tusen takk skal du ha. Vi åpner for spørsmål og innspill nå, frem til klokka 10. Og jeg har som plan i dag at vi er helt presise. Så uansett om det bobler av spørsmål klokka 10, så slutter vi da. Fordi vi har muligheten til å snakke i pausene, og det kommer en paneldebatt i kveld. Vil du styre det selv, eller vil du at jeg skal...
Jeg kan prøve at styre det, så ligesom gør jeg i går. Hvis jeg ikke kan, så kan du jo tage over.
Da reiser jeg mig hjem. Vær så god.
Ja. Men jeg har egentlig bare tænkt mig at svare på dansk, så hvis I nu ikke forstår, så bed mig om at gentage, eller gentage svaret på engelsk. Hvis der er nogle spørgsmål, så er jeg meget villig. Det var soleklart.
Jeg lurer på en ting som vi snakket om i går, altså den nordkoreanske propagandaen fremstår jo som latterlig sett med våre øyne.
Ja.
Og nå har du nevnt at det er opportunt for dem å fremstå som litt gale. Er de klar over virkningen den propagandaen har i vår del av verden? Hvordan de oppfatter den?
Ja, det tror jeg de er. Og jeg tror vi skal huske på, når vi taler nordkoreansk propaganda, så husk på, at der er mange, man taler til mange grupper. Nordkoreansk propaganda taler til det nordkoreanske folk. Nordkoreansk propaganda, noget af den taler også til USA, noget af det der taler til Kina. Så der er mange audiences, vil man sige på engelsk. Altså der er mange, man taler til mange grupper af mennesker, og vi skal huske på, hvornår de gør hvad. Når nordkoreansk propaganda virker lidt galt og lidt utilregneligt, så er det, når de taler til omverdenen. Det er af gode grunde ikke deres eget. Altså billedet, som jeg viste af Kim Il-sung, omgivet af børn, Kim Il-sung og Kim Jong-il. Det billede øverst her, det er helt åbenlyst intern propaganda til ære for folket. Det skal vise velvilje. Man vil jo helst opnå positiv holdning og opbakning omkring ledelsen via indoktrinering og positiv propaganda. Hvis det ikke virker, så kan man bruge straf. Men i første instans, i skolebøgerne, i kunsten, i kulturen, der vil man helst gøre sådan her. Til gengæld, så skal man være meget, og vi ser, hvordan det gentager sig, ikke? Den her er fra forsiden på Brian Myers bog, og det er noget, man er helt opmærksom på, men man iscenesætter de her ting til ære for folket. Det er den ene side af det. Den anden side af det er jo propagandaen udadtil. Det er propagandaen, der skal sende stærke signaler til omverdenen, til Sydkorea, men først og fremmest til USA. Sydkorea er jo ikke en aktør, som Nordkorea tager specielt seriøst. De er gode til at udspille Washington og Seoul mod hinanden. Det er derfor, vi nogle gange ser dialog med Seoul og dialog med Washington, men aldrig samtidig. Og altid sådan, så det ikke er koordineret. Men det her, det er jo propaganda, der skal sende et signal til USA, sørge for, at der er en klar distance mellem forståelsen blandt. De bliver amerikanerne bliver ofte omtalt som bastarder, som hunde i det nordkoreanske sprog, og det hører man fra deres pressemeddelelser og nyhedsoplæserne osv. Der er brug for, at man hele tiden er meget fjendtlig i forhold til USA. Så det tror jeg, at man skal huske på, når man kigger på nordkoreansk propaganda, at der er den positive propaganda til ære for folket, og så er der den negative propaganda, som godt må virke en lille smule gal, når man signalerer til omverdenen. Stein, du havde et...
Jeg ville bare spørge dig om Pyongyangs,
ja.
Den korvetten, som altså gik ned i mars 2010.
Ja.
Og du viste et kart over hvor den nordkoreanske ubåten kunne ha gått. Og så skrev du nederst at det at Kina, Russland og ASEAN svarte med usikkerhet på dette her, det gjorde dette til en suksessrik operasjon fra Nordkorea. Betyr dette at du er overbevist om at den ble senket av en torpedo fra en nordkoreansk undervandsbåt?
Det er jo interessant, fordi jeg var opmærksom på den her situation, og det er vigtigt. Nu skal du huske, at du siger, at jeg kaldte en succesfuld operation fra Nordkorea, men det gjorde jeg jo faktisk ikke. Jeg kaldte... Ja, der står bare ikke Nordkorea der.
Men hvem kunne det ellers? Okay, den skjønte jeg ikke.
Så pointen er, at jeg tager ikke stilling til, hvem der gjorde det her. Jeg siger bare, at i lyset af kalkylerne, i lyset af svaret fra Kina, Rusland og ASEAN, at det her en succesfuld strategisk eller taktisk operation. Det kunne det også være fra alle mulige andre nordkoreanerne. Så jeg har ikke, jeg har også læst rapporterne, og jeg har også, du ved, de her ting med missilet, der blev fyret af, det kan ikke passe, det kom fra Pyongyang, og der blev skrevet ting på, og der er mange spekulationer. Og jeg har beskæftiget mig nok med efterretningsverdenen, og har hørt om nok false flag operationer, som man kalder dem, til at jeg vil aldrig nogensinde stå her og sige, at jeg tror 100% på, at Nordkorea stod bag eller ikke stod bag. Jeg tror ikke, at vi kommer frem til et endegyldigt svar. Jeg kan bare sige, at hvis man laver kalkylen, så er der mange, der måske kunne have en interesse i en sådan operation. Det kunne sydkoreanerne for så vidt. Men altså, så ryger vi jo meget hurtigt, og det er, altså, jeg er ikke glad for at gå ned af den argumentationsrække, fordi vi ryger meget hurtigt over i noget konspirationsteori, som man skal være meget varsom med. Ligesom at jeg synes, man skal være lige så varsom med at sige, at det var nordkoreanerne. Så skal man være lige så varsom med at sige, at det kunne lige så godt have været Sydkorea, eller USA eller Kina, eller hvem man nu kan drømme op en udliciteret operation til en privat operatør, eller hvad man nu ønsker at komme op med. Jeg siger ikke, at det var en nordkoreansk operation. Jeg siger bare, at det var succesfuld i forhold til gråzone-argumentet. Geir?
Ja, det som jeg tænker på, det er, at hvis nå det overhovedet ikke var en aktiv handling av en operatør, men en ulykke, så kommer du jo til at bruge det i din teori for at begrunde hvor rationel og fornuftig den er. Men i virkeligheden så er det bare en diskussion om hvordan man bruger hændelser i en betændt ideologisk politisk atmosfære. Yes. Og der er jo faktisk et par eksperter, en i Kina og en i Japan, som har en teori om at det var en ulykke. Og den teorien må man altså egentlig ikke diskutere i Sydkorea.
Nej.
Så hvad er dit respons på det?
Nu er der mange ting, man ikke må diskutere i Sydkorea, og det har jeg selv oplevet meget. Jeg har egentlig den holdning til ting, at jeg fra naturens side er ret god til at udforske de mindre oplagte scenarier. Det er bare ikke alle sammen, man skal tale. Slet ikke, når man er i Sydkorea. Fordi det bliver man ikke populær ved. Og så skaber man så mange fjender, som du også er opmærksom på selvfølgelig. Uanset hvem der stod bag, hvis det var en fjendtlig handling, eller om det var en ulykke, så opnår den det, som blandt andet er i Pyongyangs interesse. Og det er at få udstillet stridigheder om Northern Limit Line, få udstillet det faktum, at Nordkorea ikke accepterer en grænse, mens der ikke er nogen tvivl om grænsen på fastlandet, demarkationslinjen og 38. breddegrad, og mens der ikke er nogen tvivl om grænsen øst for Korea-halvøen, så er der stor tvivl, i hvert fald fra Nordkoreans side, og det hjælper ikke noget, at vi i Vesten bliver ved med at hamre i bordet og sige, at det er Northern Limit Line, og det er den, I skal acceptere, for de gør det ikke. Og de får udstillet dem, der nu står bag, eller ikke står bag, så bliver konflikten og gråzonen omkring Northern Limit Line og øerne, og hvad du end vil have, den bliver udstillet i sådan en situation. Og det kan meget vel være, at der er nogen, der har haft det til formål, og det kan også være, at tilfældigheden har bragt den situation i spil. Men det ændrer ikke ved det faktum, at det her spiller i min optik ind i kortene på Pyongyang.
Du begynte med å si at vi vet lite om Nordkorea, og opinionen generelt vet lite om det, kanskje også forskere.
Ja.
Men det ikke også lite vi vet om sørkoreansk virkelighet, NATO-politikk i området, japansk historie i regionen.
Ja.
Så det ikke bare én ukjent her.
Nej, men det er rigtigt. Der er mange ukendte. Og det er, altså, der er... Det er jo lidt bizarrt i virkeligheden, når man kigger på sådan noget som rational choice teori, som bygger på det de kalder en unitary actor. Det som rational choice teori bygger på, det er, at regimet har én beslutningstager. Derfor kan det nogle gange, hvis man accepterer, at lederen er i kontrol, eller menneskerne omkring ham er i kontrol, og der ikke er fraktionsdannelse osv., så kan det være nemmere at analysere nordkoreanske handlinger. I Sydkorea, hvor der er nogle demokratiske principper i spil, som der er i USA, Japan og andre steder, der kan det faktisk være lidt sværere at forstå rationalet bag. Jeg er helt enig med dig i, at der er meget historielæsning, som de øvrigt laver meget af ude i Sydkorea. Det er derfor, det er fantastisk at lære om konflikten, når man er derude. Fordi vi er ikke gode nok på historien til at Kissinger, han sagde engang, at diplomater, de skal læse to ting. De skal læse historie og filosofi. Fordi når de læser filosofi, så lærer de at tænke, og når de læser historie, så lærer de at bruge den viden, vi allerede har i deres tænkning. Og der synes jeg, noget af det, vi mangler for eksempel, det er blandt andet noget af forståelsen for japansk historie og kultur og Sydkorea osv. Så jeg er meget enig i dit argument. Der er mange ukendte faktorer, og måske er Nordkorea ikke den sværeste aktør at forstå i den her konflikt.
Det synes jeg var en veldig slående avslutningslinje. Selv om det var i og for seg tilfeldig sted jeg bare slo inn, nemlig når klokken ble 10. Ja. Vi har en lang dag foran oss med mange tunge og viktige innlegg. Det blir full anledning til å diskutere. Jeg unnskylder de som nå har rukket hånden opp og har spørsmål, men det blir anledninger senere til å stille. Tusen takk skal du ha, Morten, for et fantastisk godt opplegg og for gode svar her, og til alle som stilte